while Pierre arrived, I'm going to thank everyone I need to thank. So thank you, Courtney, and thank you, François, for hosting us tonight. It's a pleasure to be welcome at the Maison Française NYU. And thank you all. Thank you, Nora. Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you, Peter, to be here tonight to celebrate the launch of the new translation by Behrman and Sinéty of Idiocy, the last novel published by Pierre Guyotat. Pierre Behrman de Sinéty grew up in Maine and lives in Paris. He was lecteur d'anglais at the École Normale Supérieure, where he taught since 2011. His translations include Éric Cheviat's Creative Invective and Maël Renoir's Fragment of an Infinite Memory. Catherine Malabou is a professor of philosophy in the Department of Comparative Literature and European Languages and Studies at UC Irvine. Her last books include Before Tomorrow, Epigenesis and Rationality, Morphing Intelligence from IQ to IA, Pleasure Erased, Equators and Thought, Stop Thief, Anarchism, Philosophy, and There Was No Revolution to be announced with Politipress in 2026. Nora translated 3 books by Guyotat, Coma, In the Deep, and Independence in 2011, and she'll talk a little bit about what independence is. She has written a number of articles on Guyotat and worked collaboratively with artists, most recently with A. L. Steiner, and the film To Change Everything. She has translated other books for senior text and works as a translation editor and sometimes editor for the press. She is lecturer faculty in the Humanities and Arts and Art History Department at San Jose State University. And I feel like thank you all for being here tonight, despite the electoral frenzy out there. And let's hope that when you go back into the world after this hour and something, we'll have great news to celebrate. And very quickly, for those of you who might not know Pierre Guyotat, who might not have read Idiocy, I'm going to do a very brief introduction. So Idiocy is to this day the last novel that was published by Guyotat. It received the Prix Médicis in 2018, and it closes what is often called Guyotat's autobiographical cycle, which was initiated in 2006 with Coma, which Nora translated. And this cycle acts as a normative counterpoint to a fictional body of work that is mainly written in tongues, en langue, in Guyotat's words. And the work in tongues of Guyotat is really a hermetic body of work with a language that is completely fragmented, completely exploded, and who compromises not only the integrity of the narrative structure, but also the syntax and sometimes even of the morphology of the words. And Guyotat literary projects situate those two formal plans in tongues and normative, I would like to believe, not really in rupture to each other, but more in continuity. Because even in normative language, what he's aiming to do is to rediscover within all the strata of French, so from the archaic, medieval, rhetorical, popular, or extra-metropolitan French, a language which allow for all forms of expression to be hosted, but also all forms of enunciation. And I think the enunciation Guyotat is most interested about is the one that is abject, one that is so submitted to historical, political violence that it cannot rise to the level of subjectivity. And Idiocy, in that respect, occupies a very interesting space in his trajectory because it returns to a time that precedes the beginning. It precedes the existence of Guyotat as an author, and it really returns on his entrée en poésie, meaning the year that he used Guyotat to conceive the formal space he wished to inhabit and to thematize the literary object he wished to take responsibility for. And so spanning over the year 1958 to 1962, when Guyotat is roughly between 18 to 22, Idiocy is marked by kind of a stammering, a repetition of original sin. So first there's Guyotat's theft and flight to Paris in 1958, where he leaves. So far his parents had leave to become a writer. And then there's, in 1962, his conscription into the Algerian army, where he decided to join not the kind of military officers he could have pretended to, but to join the corps of common soldiers. while supporting Algeria's independence. And this support led him to be tried for sedition, which resulted in him being imprisoned 3 months in solitary confinement in a pit underneath the military kitchen. And Guyotat find in this mortal condemnation a kind of paradoxical retribution for both his personal transgression and kind of the historical crime of colonization. Nothing is pure, he's mumbling after sitting from his cover. Nothing is pure, he writes again when he's thrown into his pit and he finds a little piece of orange paper on which he writes a sentence. So with Idiocy, Guyotat refuses to present himself as a hero nor as a saint, but rather he embraces his redoubled guilt as both a thief and an unwilling colonizer. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming Malabou to the stage for her presentation on the on the plasticity of Guyotat language and its provinces.
Thank you so much for being here. It's extremely difficult to say anything about Guyotat, so I'll do my best. And what I want to say first is that when I first encountered his work as a young philosopher, I was really struck by the violence of his language. I have written about him twice before, first in a text entitled Le E muet et la derbuka, where I tried to understand the suppression of the mute E, le E muet in French, as both a linguistic mutilation and a metaphysical gesture. And later, in a reflection on coma, which I read as a reawakening of syntax, a return to normative language after the delirium of erasure. But this return also, the return to la langue normative language, I felt that it was extremely violent as a kind of self-erasure. So in any way I could read him, I was always struck by the same violence. And today, in the context of this conversation on idiocy, I'd like to bring briefly these earlier reflections into dialogue to trace across Guyotat's writing the plastic metamorphoses of language from destruction to recovery and from recovery to a kind of luminous dispossession where violence is in a certain sense sublimated. So in the first text, Le E muet et la derbuka, I confronted the suppression of almost all the E muet, as you know, French words very, very often end with E. So you don't pronounce them, that's why they're called mute, but they are like the breath of French language. And to suppress them is extremely violent because I interpreted this suppression as killing something like the child or the animal, or even the woman of the French language. The E muet are extremely important, and they are beautiful because precisely they are the rhythm of our language, and at the same time they are mute. So, yes, I think Guyotat was someone who could not stand innocence, the innocence of the language. And he himself wrote, the almost total suppression of the mute E is an effect of my death drive. And so this is what I interpreted as the destructive plasticity of Guyotat. I mean, this capacity to make language explode and to introduce death into writing. And I read those texts as scenes of linguistic amputation. The erasure of the E muet was a form of self-mutilation, but also of sovereignty. And this is the second violence I noticed in Guyotat. Because in doing that, in mutilating the language, he was reappropriating it as if he had the fantasy of a total ownership of French language. So there is a kind, I don't know if you will agree with me, that a kind of self-liberation in Guyotat. He acts as a soldier in language and at the same time as a king, as if French was belonging to him, so to speak. And he insists also very much on the truth that he's trying to buckle himself up in French language, and he writes, I feed myself as speakers of myself. Yeah, so you can see this loop of both disappearing, mutilating language, and at the same time dominating it. But of course, even in this violence, in the beginning, I thought I wouldn't read him. I thought this literature was absolutely disgusting because of that, because of this fantasy of killing, murdering, and at the same time reappropriating. But then I insisted and discovered that what was fascinating and sublating this violence was the rhythm. Because in fact, there's a generosity, which is the other side of this violence. And at some point, it's like, it is as if an angel was also passing by in language. And that's very fascinating, how this violence at some point disappeared. And that's why I did the derbuka, which is an instrument, a little drum, Arabic drum. And so I call my text the Emu and la derbuka because it was a kind of, the derbuka, the rhythm was balancing the suppression of the E. And that was the second stage of the plasticity, this kind of recreation of life, of rhythm, of balance within destruction. Then the second text I wrote was about coma. And for me, this book was, of course, the counter movement. When I said in the beginning that this is a text where Guyotat writes in normative language, that is normal French, so you have all the mute E's, you have everything, and the death right disappears. But at the same time, I thought it was also very violent because it was a way to, I always had a problem with the passage from en langue to langue normative in Guyotat, because it is a way of erasing oneself. And the text I wrote was about that. Like, who are you? What has become of you, Guyotat? Who are you? Are you now this distinguished French writer who doesn't mutilate language? Who are you? And here also, I was struck at some point by the rhythm that was in a certain sense repairing this new scene of reappropriation. And then came Idiocy that was just translated. And I think that it is a third stage of plasticity between the first destruction and the second resurrection, so to speak. I said it was a kind of dispossession. It seems to me that in this book, the language no longer kills or feels, even if it fights against family, against colonial power. And Nora will talk about Algerian war in a moment. It's a revolt against French language, but it does not destroy. It becomes nomadic. It doesn't destroy and it doesn't repair. So it's a kind of third continent, I would say, in Guyotat, a sort of a third stage between destruction and regeneration, between sovereignty or reappropriation and dispossession. So I hope we can also say a few words. I won't do it, but about sexuality, which is the most. I think everything I said could be reintroduced on the sexual scene because it's very it's so important in Guyotat. I will just quote Foucault, who wrote after the censorship of Eden, in your text, sexuality passes to the other side of the individual and ceases to be subjective. I like this idea of passing to the other side. And I think, yes, this is what is so fascinating in Guyotat, is that one plasticity passes into another, etc., etc. And it's true that in the end, it's the subject that disappears. So, yeah, these were my few remarks. Yes, this rhythm, mysterious rhythm between violence, sovereignty, humility as well, self-erasure, self-reappropriation, etc. yes, that for me incarnate all the stages of plasticity.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And I would really like for us to get back to some of the points you mentioned, but I think first we'll hear a little bit about both translators of Pierre. And I think the first question I would have for you to start a conversation is, you both were to meet with Pierre. You met with him more or less regularly when translating his books. And I was wondering if this presence, the ability to have your question answered, was hindering or freeing in translating his work. And I don't know if any of you wants to start.
Yeah. Pierre, speaking with Pierre was, I couldn't have done it without those conversations. When I first started, it was Bernard who called me and asked me if I wanted to translate Pierre Guyotat. Which is the question. There's only one answer, which is yes. But as soon as I hung up the phone, the second question, which is how. And this was one of the texts en langue, the text in tongues, Joyeux animaux de la misère, merry animals of misery. And it's this very thorny text. I mean, look on the page, it looks like some kind of medieval hieroglyphics that were such a thing. And Pierre invited me to come and make a recording of him reading. So I do this thing with a borrowed, giving me an LFD, Radio France International microphone I borrowed. And I heard Pierre read the text. And suddenly I heard this structure of sound. And it's this harmony that somehow parallels the logical world of the text at the same time. And suddenly I knew a way that I could translate it, or something that I heard that I could try and create. And from that reading, immediately I started thinking about Pierre really in terms of sound. So this could be something as basic as Pierre telling me that a lot of the language of these works in tongues, they come from Pierre's father was a country doctor and would go on house calls in the region near Lyon, Bourg-Argental, and he heard the speech of maybe what was the last generation of peasants of this region in words that are stretching back centuries, and that come into his writing. Pierre was talking about the openness one time. I remember he was talking about the openness of the A's, the A in this, and that would come in my choice of words. How do you know I have, or how do you know about? And you choose the about, you try to get that openness. And then also a lot of the sounds. There's a phrase in Pierre, l'éveil des lèvres, the e-verse of the lips, right? Les lèvres, which would be something like the rise of the lips. But when you really start to look at it, it's they're anagrams of each other. They go kind of like this, l'éveil des lèvres. And so that would become in English the spill of the lips. And you try and recreate those movements that you're hearing. Then,
yeah, spill of the lips, yeah. Awesome.
Then the second thing of speaking with Pierre was ambiguity, and it was extraordinary to what extent there was no stupid question to Pierre. I mean, there were plenty of stupid questions I asked, but they weren't perceived as such. I could ask anything. And even I started asking even the most simple things, and some of them would have simple answers. But sometimes, because of this incredible logical world that's there, that's in Pierre's head, some of it doesn't even beyond what makes it into the book. You'd have the most extraordinary things would come out. One of them comes to mind. There's this passage in Joyeux animaux de la misère which takes place in a brothel, and it's all voices. It's all the voices of the whores and the clients. And at one point, there's writing on shit on the backs. And I said, Pierre, I mean, why is there writing shit on the backs? And he said, oh no. He said, this is really terrible. Yeah, that was the thing about Pierre. Pierre had this kind of, I don't know what it is, but it's this. Pierre's works come from elsewhere in a way that he himself was terrified and horrified by his works. and would be in a bad way for 2 or 3 days after reading. Just had to face this atrocity that had come from his head. And said, this one's really terrible. He said, they didn't have any more paint to write the prices of the horrors on the backs. So the only thing they had was they had the shit in the pile here, and they took it and they had to write it there. In this book, I have a book with Pierre. I have maps, here. So that's one kind of ambiguity, which is you're not sure what it comes out of. But there's another very interesting kind of ambiguity, which is that intentional ambiguity. There was a poet I worked on before translating Pierre called Geoffrey Hill. There was this wonderful line about people who crave ambiguity in plain speaking, as I do. This idea of one word that's intentionally hitting 2 or 3 meanings at the same time, and those are precise. And when you can ask, all of my questions to Pierre were in French and about the French, where you can ask Pierre which 3 meanings he's trying to hit. You can then go back to the English and try and find a word that has those meanings. I mean, it's still like kind of throw 4 darts at the same time. At least you're not completely blindfolded too. Those were the main things with Pierre.
Can I add a couple things to what you were saying? It's interesting. This question of shit is really important, I think, for all of us. The question of shit is really important. We should be composting. We should not be using drinking water to get rid of our shit. The shit at the center of those books, that they're all using a shit hole. There is nothing else but just a hole. And it's Job. It's a mountain of shit. And that's what we're wading through. It's like the legacy of the colonial West, it's a really very real thing. But we're walking through it. I remember one time I was like in Abidjan. It was like between the 2 revolutions, and I went to this place, Princess Street, and there was a flood. There was rain, not even a flood. I went to the bathroom. I was up to here in shit because just the sewage did it. So, I mean, we can understand these things are real, and he's using the word very clearly to mean a real situation. And for us, perhaps it's embarrassing and we don't really like to talk about it, but we're pretty much deep in it. It's pretty clear in all our symbolic masquerades about what's meaningful, in all our hidden violence to each other through symbolic love. He was really working against that. So I just want to add that about this question of shit. Yeah, the shit is the price that we put on ourselves. It's written in shit, and we're all, our price is here. It's very clear vision of what ecocidal, racialized, extractivist capitalism is. It's very clear, I think, and it stinks. The other thing I wanted to say was in regards to your second point, but I don't remember now, so maybe I'll.
But Nora, you're saying that the post-colonial context was very important for you when translating independence, and maybe you could talk a little bit about what independence is and how you think of translating it and the context in which it inserted itself. So Guyotat's work is like a very long work of the whole life of more than maybe 70 years of writing, 60 years. He starts as a teenager, working with the beat sheet and masturbating and writing. And in those early beginnings, he's already at school as a 10-year-old, masturbating under the desk, and then in his underwear that he hides under rocks, and his mother extracts it to do the laundry, so there's all this stuff about feminism and about labor, and about the seminal work, and about excretion, and about language, and the kind of undercurrent of violence of language that's there from the beginning. We don't like to talk about it in a very polite society, but his work is very long. And then there's a moment where his attempt to deal with the enormity of the violence, I think this is what you were saying, coma,
and prostitution, Eden, the colonial situation, the Algerian independence. His reaction is self-destructive because, as a white man, I mean, that's not the single definition. That's a very kind of problematic way to say it, but I'll say it like that. Just, as a human inhabiting this earth and with that history. So it does become self-destructive, and Coma is the story of a descent into hell, where he takes too much. He chains himself to his writing table, and he's writing the book in the late 70s. He's going around, he's nomadic, so he's living in his camping car. He is trying to refuse all the trappings of bourgeois life. He's a very petty bourgeois from the countryside. So that first moment, but I think the work is to be understood in a large trajectory that is very much about a song. But so I was asked, I think maybe 2006 or something, there was a reading by Chris Kraus, a book called Video Green, LA and Nothingness. And then we went to dinner. And Hedy El-Khalti, who is a managing editor for Semiotext, was like, "Oh, do you want to translate Coma?" And I'm like, "I don't know Guyotat." So I was like, "Sure, great." I was very impressed and want to do it. And I think for me, I was a young academic, wanted to be an academic and wanted to be a writer. And so that first translation of Coma was very meaningful on a personal level, because he was a kind of mentor in a sense. And I could give my voice and give my body to the transmission of this thing. And it was, for me, very much like a horizontal transmission of a voice and translation, in the sense of holding close or trying to be as invisible as possible, or to be really in service to a text, so there's a very, I guess for me, kind of religious power to that, which is not absent from Guyotat's work. In a letter to Salman Rushdie, when Salman Rushdie was under the fatwa, he says, we also, he thanks him. He says, what can be done for you, Salman Rushdie, who has done his duty in prolonging the Quran, like some of us prolong the two Testaments? And then Idiocy is also full of references to Catholicism and Christianity. There's a scene, maybe we could talk about it, or you could talk about it, that Guyotat finally pulled. He has a soldier. They're coming back from Algeria. They're 21 or 19. They've just been soldiers in Algeria, occupying force that has actually lost the war, and they have to retreat in humiliation back to France, and have to embody that subjective position of being the colonizer coming back. And on the boat, there's the passage of the Red Sea, there's all of these ideas that have come from the Testaments and the Old Testament, and a lot of references to the Hebrew stories. And he pulls a desiccated bone of a fish that is stopping the guy and choking him. And so he's and it's bloodied, and it's the Christ that's lost its flesh in the sin of this world. So for me, it was very kind of powerful. And I guess also on a personal level, Guyotat he believed in this tradition and possibility of the avant-garde. I don't know if it's still possible, if people still believe in it. I hope people do still believe in it, that language and literature and art, he didn't call himself a writer, but an artist, could transform society, that there could be some kind of revolution, that his language was really ontological and like getting to the origin, like really kind of digging these very deep questions about, I don't want to say metaphysics because that's also a problem because it would be a meta, but physics, the physics of creation. So that was also very important. And then I want to say a third thing about translating him, which is also something that you're not supposed to say in good company, but like his works are very much engaging, like genital experience, even if it's really gross, problematic and like bondage and horrible and stuff. So as a translator in the deep, yeah, you have to pass that whole thing through, and so there are like physiological, I think, experiences that you have as a translator. And that's also part of it, I think. So in the sense, it's like, you're very close to him. He's a kind of father, a kind of mother, a kind of brother. He has a very he scrambled a lot of those definitions about the phallus and the female and the male, and in his early work, and like he talks about his phallus producing milk, so there's all of this is scrambled, and so these three things I would say about translation. Personal, meaningful for me, that I was like the voice of this person who believed in literature, like I really believed in literature. I still, I guess, hopefully believe in it. And I hope that we can have a literature for, radical social transformation. Then the physical experience of it, and then kind of, vertical experience of the song. And he calls the parts of Tune for 500,000 Soldiers songs, and it's very clear that there is this effort at the speaking in tongues and the word, it's like the word, right, of God. But it is a word that has like fallen, and so there's a very complex, I think, and proliferating kind of understanding of how the transformation that Catherine is talking about occurs physiologically and materially, and he gives new explanations of like the creation in the different works and these kind of metaphysical ways that language is transformed, that language transforms reality, that fiction and reality intermix, that the present and the past kind of can explode against one another, so yes, that's where I will end.
I really like what you mentioned about verticality, because that's definitely something that I think you mentioned, Pierre, and there's this very famous quote by Foucault talking about Pierre's writing and saying it's immobile comme la pluie, it's still like the rain. And so there's a sense that it's not a real stillness because there's still a sense of movement and gravity. And it feels like French is a very static language, or at least it allows for stillness to arise within a sentence, whereas English feels way more dynamic. There's a flow, and I was wondering how it was trying to kind of move the stillness of French language, of Pierre's language, more importantly within the English.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's something about that part of Pierre that's you can't really differentiate from. We're talking this logical structure of the world, of Pierre's world, that there's something almost of reckoning or of judgment. It's part of this kind of radical empathy that Pierre had. Mm-hmm. Pierre had this thing that he called that navri, like the spin or the tendril or the gimlet. It's like this thing coming out, and it's the immediate projection at any one instant into all past and all future. And this is something that comes in his writing, but it's something that was him, how he experienced life. You could be walking in the metro and a homeless person would ask him, for money. Pierre was always incredibly generous through this empathy, but he would actually, in that moment, he would have seen this person's beginnings and what awaited him. And he would be shaken. He would be shaken by it for a time. And that really
also called it supernatural tenderness.
Supernatural tenderness. That's a beautiful way to put it. Beautiful phrase. And so this comes into the writing of Pierre. That, if you think of if an arm is raised to commit some act of atrocity or of love, and between the moment when that arm is raised and when it comes down, you need to understand everything that has gone into that act before and maybe even after, in the consequences. You're really going to weigh this act in judgment. Mm-hmm. So that actually becomes a question of syntax, right? And French can hold that very well. French, for whatever reason, you can put a lot of things between a verb and a direct object in French. He hit with an intensity that he had learned in the backyard of his home from his father, who wanted him to be a professional baseball player, which he did not manage to do, the ball. Try that in French and you'll have better luck. There's something about the French language that saying that, whereas in English there's really the press of the verb. And so this was something where we get back to this idea of sound, of rhythm, which I love that you spoke of, that there's ways that through rhythm, or at least I tried to find ways of making French act more like English. And somehow you kind of bounce the sentence along, or you get things hovering in a way, kind of like spinning plates. And sometimes you feel like they all fall down before you get to the verb. But then there's some other way, some configuration where you can actually keep everything in the air long enough to get the verb. And that really gets you to a key part of Pierre, which is, so I love that you mentioned this quotation of Foucault, where he talks about Pierre's immobile comme la pluie. If you think of this plane, and you think of a thunderstorm, and you think of one instant in that thunderstorm, and you think of every raindrop on that plane, and that one cross section, you were to account for every raindrop, and in that moment, and then it all comes down at the same time and simultaneously, and that's where you get this kind of force, this torrent of Pierre's writing, which is at the same time almost like a stasis, or has this incredible suspension to it as well, which you try to find ways to bring across into English.
Right, and also very material propositions that are, kind of in Latin, where you can associate the syntaxes, like you could put them anywhere, and so they are constructed as like blocks, material blocks of things and objects and accumulated perceptions, right? But I think, very physical and concrete.
You talked about Latin, and Pierre's prose is definitely influenced by Latin a lot. But what I think is interesting is that in Idiocy there are so many mentions of books that belong to English literature. There's mention of Faulkner, there's mention of Hardy, and sometimes it seems that he was able to read them in their original language. So I wonder, to what extent you could say that you have this idea that when translating something, you're moving it from like its original language further away to like another language. But to an extent, maybe with considering the importance English literature had for him, in translating it to English, we're maybe translating it back and maybe returning it to an origin it had in those texts.
I could say something, then you could say, in the Deep, which is a book that he wrote in the series of the normative language kind of self-fictions, 3 Days and 3 Nights as a young teenager, where he goes to England. So I think it is very much in the infancy of his writing, and his personal life, his physiological life, and his metaphysical life and his literary life are all really very much, and also his political life, very much intertwined, right? So he is tender as well with his own youth and the errors and the, kind of trying to be a poet but so when he goes as a young kid, that's also very foundational, I think, for the writing. And so I think he also heard sometimes in English, but I'm not so sure that it would go correct English, but he's nonetheless heard in English, the texts being said. Yeah. So go ahead. Yes. And then there's stuff about Faulkner and yeah.
Pierre told me that he thought of how his titles would be in English. Idiocy is a really easy title to translate. The rest is difficult. But in a very literal sense, there is this returning to English where Faulkner dies right at the moment of independence for Algeria.
The next day.
And the next day.
Like a sleep for the in Japan on the day.
And is this going to be something you're talking about later? And so they hear this on the radio, and Pierre reads to the troop. They say, "Read us the book, Pierre. Read us the book." And Pierre reads Faulkner to them, which in the French is in Poindreau's translation. Poindreau is the voice of Faulkner to all French, to South, to everybody who heard these times. And so this translation actually returns Faulkner to its original. You have it there, which is kind of daunting because your translation has to be around Faulkner. So there was that sense, but also, so through Faulkner, the title Idiocy, it touches through to The Sound and the Fury. But I feel like through that, it touches further to Macbeth, which you'll see throughout Idiocy as well. When Pierre's about 20 years old, not yet of majority in France, because that happened at 21, he's written a book that's difficult about his family, and his father refuses to let him sign his name, and Pierre takes the pen name of Donalbain, the son of Duncan. And you have all these recurring sort of resonances with Macbeth throughout the book that I became more and more conscious of. And at certain times, I realized that for those resonances to work, I wanted the text in English to be able to touch the things that it was touching in the French. I think every writer is writing within the texture of a language where the words that they're using are words that have been used elsewhere and that retain these resonances from that elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So there's one moment right after the independence. There's the road, and they're wondering if the road's suddenly going to kind of come alive with people storming the camp. And I was reading this, and the way it happens, it's Birnam Wood. It's Macbeth wondering if Birnam Wood's going to come to him. And so, in a very subtle way, I did go. This can be overdone, but here I did go back to Macbeth. And I just wanted to know what word it was in Macbeth when Birnam Wood comes, and it moves. Birnam Wood is moving. And it's twice. It moves and it's moving. Right. And so I did put in my translation, will the road move for these people? To allow that. That kind of goes into a greater context where Pierre knew the depth and the breadth of French language like no one else that I've ever met. And his writings exist in that. And so you try and find a way to make a translation exist in that texture of the new language.
Could I add something in here? I could add to that. Kind of in a word that's moving and not really know where you're going. I like translation because it is very pragmatic, and you have to find solutions, and you have the word in front of you, and you just have to find a solution. So you're constantly brought back to like a real thing, and then you might have like all of these thoughts and ideas and references, but then you're always going to have to like make actually a choice, and so you're moving at a very close range of like, okay, this word, and you're kind of operating like that, not really knowing where you're going. I mean, you've read the book. Sometimes I like not read books, and I like actually don't know where I'm going. But it's a practice like that of proximity, and so maybe I thought I could read this here. So this is.
A little bit about what's inspired.
Yeah, so he had written this book. It was an article, a text that he wrote for the NRF for the 100th anniversary of Laghmara. And then we did so I worked with Seretext, and we published Coma first of his, and then this was a book tour for Coma, and so we came here, actually with Edmund White. We came to Columbia. We went to Columbia, and then we went to San Francisco City Lights, and we went to the Mac Schindler House in LA. And it was really wonderful to be with him on that tour, him and I. And I think that's very powerful memory that I have. But so we did this little book with it. Yeah. And there's a picture here, which is actually from Hedi's archive. Hedi is the managing editor, and he's from Morocco. And so I'll just read 3 paragraphs. I have no idea of the place where they are leading me, how far from here or for how long. How many years? For what forced labor or prison? And if they are even leading me somewhere at all. But the independence, the happiness of these people, I want that. Millet, the driver, and the staff sergeant stop to piss. The old dog, depleted by drink in Indochina, takes a long time to discharge. His machine gun shakes on his shoulder. Black rocks at the bottom of the slope. The engine of the Jeep is in neutral. Temptation of flight. Brush in the slope. What lies below? Forests, gorge, herd. To betray and to find myself alone in military guard in the cosmos. My body still haunted by doubt. Here, aren't I atoning for my presumptuousness with others? Prior weaknesses? And how can I get rid of my servitude to all things? What good would I be to the other side? He's a soldier, right? And he's thinking about flight. He's been arrested for rebellion against authority. And then he'll be put in solitary confinement. And then that's kind of replaced at the center of Idiocy, this text. He took out the beginning and then kind of shifted a little bit at the end to integrate it into the narrative. And it is a story of the liberation of Algeria and this his experience as a young soldier there.
Then I think it would be a great opportunity to hear some part of the same chapter, and maybe the end that was fleshed out in the form of Idiocy. And if you would like to read the English, and if you would like to read the French afterwards.
It's not the same as
You're reading the same as Peter.
Okay.
So this is Pierre's been found guilty of corrupting the morale of the army. Almost Socratic. And inciting desertion, falsely accused for his pamphlets and his writings. He's been locked in a hole in the ground for 3 months. He's come out and he's in this sort of reform company of other conscripts and soldiers who committed various crimes. and he's trying to make it to the end of his conscription to be freed. I am summoned to the offices. It's to give me a package forwarded by my former company, which a dear family that has come to replace my own has mailed to me. Already opened, its contents scattered about on the sub-lieutenant's table. I have to give him an explanation of each object. Does he write fiction too? A little Jesus sausage from Haute Loire, a belated wool sweater, so I have to spend another winter in the army, a pipe, and a book of Faulkner's, The Mansion, recently published. What's this Faulkner about? From what I know of the history of French and European colonization, the violent conquest, the plundered and the profiteers, the small and large estates, the urban and rural servitude, the bonds between the subjugated and their masters, and from what I know of Faulkner, having read The Unvanquished and a little of Absalom, I prepare myself to speak of the South. But at the sound of the sub-lieutenant's pied noir accent, I refrain from replying, for fear that the evocation of a people vanquished for its inextinguishable sin might lead him to believe I am thinking of his own people and cause him to denounce me as an agitator again. Sensation of my idiocy here. How I feel inferior to whoever bears stripes and corrupts and shouted commands our language, which I have now begun to reject along with the territory that is its host. What authority, except divine, could make me bow my head now? Not even the authority of French history, which, here, a portion of the officers are dishonoring and causing to be dishonored. So I come back to the little Jesus from Isengol, but not for too long, or he might confiscate it and eat it. Even though I am prohibited from approaching any signal machine whatsoever, I begin reading the book in PH's radio room. To the sound of his guitar, which I transform into that of a southern banjo, I read the opening pages. I'll have to wait for my uncertain liberation in November to see what it is in the original language, how it sings and moves and takes on color. Mink Snopes, the trial, the return to his murder of Jack Houston, the motives, the cow, the fence post. An illumination. I must create an of the beast, of the idiot who speaks, of nothing. Still a little more French psychological fiction with characters. It's in the 4x4 command car that I wrote a few months ago while waiting for the battalion commander, the prologue to a book that would be published 2 years later. And then, soon, the epic of the idiot. Through the idiot, destroy humanism. Comprehend the political monster, the monster of the camps, cultured and prevent the most vile dehumanization. And of the fixed idea. What's Antigone after all? What's Electra? Christ himself. The more the mind and its preoccupations are limited, the more the word is beautiful and ample. The fixed idea is a piercing and shattering apart of the real. Clamor, disturbances around the camp, lone figures passing restlessly, dark with the sun, with wandering, with hunger, with heat. It's of their ruminations that I'll make my future poetry.
Congratulations. Je suis appelée au bureau. C'est pour me remettre et expédier de mon ancienne compagnie un colis envoyé par une famille chère et ayant remplacé la mienne. Déjà ouvert, son contenu disposé sur la table du sous-lieutenant, je dois donner des explications sur chaque objet. Fait-il lui aussi de la fiction? Métis-Horizon, Jésus de Haute-Loire, un tricot tardif, devrais-je passer encore un hiver sous les drapeaux, une pipe et un volume de Faulkner, le domaine, récemment paru. Qu'est-ce que ce Faulkner? Puisque que je sais de l'histoire de la colonisation française et européenne, de l'Algérie, de la conquête violente, des spoliés et des profiteurs, des petites et grandes propriétés, de la domesticité urbaine et rurale, des liens entre assujettis et maîtres, de ce que je connais de Faulkner, ayant lu l'Invaincu et un peu d'Absalom. Je me prépare à parler du Sud, mais à son accent pied noir, je me retiens de lui répondre, craignant que l'évocation d'un peuple vaincu pour sa faute inextinguible ne lui fasse croire que je pense au sien et qu'il me dénonce comme réagitateur. Sensation de mon idiocy, ici, à me ressentir inférieur à ceux qui portent galon et dévoient, dans les ordres criés, notre langue, qu'avec son territoire porteur, je commence alors de rejeter. Quelle autorité autre que divine pourrait alors me faire courber la nuque? Pas même celle de l'histoire de France, qu'ici, pour une part d'entre eux, ils déshonorent et font déshonorer. Retour donc au petit Jésus, dit Saint Jean. Mais pas trop, parce qu'il pourrait me le confisquer et me le manger. Malgré qu'on me défende d'approcher la moindre machine de transmission, je commence le livre, dans le local radio de PH. Au son de sa guitare, que je transforme en celui d'un banjo du Sud, je lis les premières pages. Il me faille attendre ma libération incertaine en novembre pour, dans la langue d'origine, voir ce que c'est, comment ça chante, et bouge et se colore. Mink Snows, le procès, retour sur son assassinat de Jacques Houston, les motifs, la vache, les piquets de clôture. Illumination. C'est de la bête que je dois faire une œuvre, de l'idiot qui parle, du rien, encore un peu de psychologie française, de personnage. C'est dans le 4-4 de commandement que j'ai écrit, quelques mois auparavant, en attendant du chef de bataillon, le prologue d'un livre apparaît 2 ans plus tard, et bientôt l'épopée de l'idiot. Par l'idiot, détruire l'humanisme. Comprendre le monstre politique ou de Kant. Le culturel n'a pas empêché la pire déshumanisation de l'idée fixe. Qu'est-ce, après tout, qu'Antigone, qu'Électre, le Christ lui-même? Plus le mental et les préoccupations sont limitées, plus le verbe est beau et ample. L'idée fixe comme percée et éclatement du réel. Rumeur, trouble autour du camp. Passage agité d'isolés noirs de soleil. D'errance, de faim, de cuit. C'est de leur rumination que je ferai ma poésie future.
I think it's such a fantastic passage because it's kind of feel Guyotat and because there's like, as you put it here, this radical empathy. But then there's like this deep interest into the voice and the administration of the weakest, the frail, the abject. But then there's the sense that the independence requires kind of found gesture. It requires momentum and movement. It cannot only be about this kind of interest in the place of the weakest. And I'm wondering how, if more, I mean, there's definitely kind of ethics and moral maybe of that, but I was wondering if White's managed to reach some kind of politics, some kind of like call to action or to like a movement or a founding gesture.
Absolutely. And this is something that you are answered. Well, I have one story while we were working as Pierre, his knee was horribly écartelé, and he had to have a knee replacement. And so I was often with him at the the rehabilitation center, but first of all in Saint Antoine, the first time he was in Saint Antoine, and he had just had his knee replaced. This is Saint Antoine. This is the place of revolution. At about 3 a.m, I got this text message with many like K's and R's and Z's, and said, aide-moi, les Boches, the Germans are here, les Boches sont là, Saint Antoine m'appelle, Pierre, il faut venir dans la rue faire la révolution. Pierre, anesthetic, post-surgery, was called by Saint Antoine himself into the street to start the revolution. But,
I wonder if you had
Did he do drugs?
that made it. It was
Yeah.
no. There was like a monk.
He did not. He did not.
Okay. Because sometimes I wonder.
Before he fell into coma, he was so anxious, and he was like not eating. This was like in 1981, and he was taking a lot of Comprogel, which is a medication for pain, but it's also an opioid. So I think that's maybe the only time. But otherwise, he was very monastic. Yes. Yeah. And there's this idea of like his soul for next life, but I'm not even sure. Perhaps at one point. I think that part of the darkness of the texts is that the revolution doesn't happen. And so then that's the element of like the despair and the self-annihilation, the death drive and stuff, because it is not, simple to just like go out to the street and do the revolution, and then the revolution, like there's the terror, it's not very, you have to transform, I don't know, you have to transform mentalities. Also, you need a political revolution and social revolution, but you also need a revolution of mentalities. And so he, I think, is very dark in terms of like that possibility of revolution. He was always more of I remember I always wanted to associate him, like when, at the beginning when I knew him, was like May 68, and that seems like such a defining moment. It was like, no, I'm not May 68. I'm the, I'm the Algerian Revolution. Like I'm not, I was in my camping car in like May 68. I wasn't with the students, and so, there's I don't know if it's despair, but in any case, in the text, I think, that comes out. That's not so simple. The revolutionary possibility of literature.
There was such a poetic revolution at the same time at that moment in France. Because I remember his texts were also performed in theaters, no?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that has totally disappeared. I think I never attended one of the performances, but I suppose it made quite a change in the dans la langue, no? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And maybe there's no better way to close this discussion than by reading a little bit more of Idiocy. Maybe the end would be a good idea. And Nora, if you want to read the French after Peter.
Do you want me to read the French first and we finish with your translation?
I'd like to finish with
French after?
Yeah. There's one thing that comes to mind in this. There's a passage in Idiocy where Pierre, there's the 72 hours of leave, and the army mates take the train to Algiers, and Pierre decides to hitchhike to see Algeria, and he gets picked up by this old man, this lawyer, and taken finally to this person's house, and stays there the night before rejoining his army mates. And there's this conversation where Pierre comes into this man's living room, and everything that's missing of culture, everything that's been taken out in this idiocy of the language and the life of the army is there. It's Stravinsky's classes, with Desnos, the Gauguin, or the old French editions. Everything is there. And Pierre speaks to this man, and Pierre told me, we were talking that this man was his double. So it's a young pair talking to his double. And it was only after Pierre had died that I completely understood what he meant by that. When I was working with Pierre, I'd finished about 2/3 of the book with questions, and the last third, I didn't have his answers for, but I was still, this was not in so many passes that I was still working on places where Pierre talked to me afterwards. And I suddenly realized that when Pierre said that this man was his double, it didn't just mean that he was writing, that it meant that, what it meant was that Pierre, when he's writing the old man, was actually writing himself at the time that I was speaking to him. And this man is in this despair about how you can think the cosmos and write the particular at the same time, how you can write anything in this knowledge of the cosmos. But I was incredibly moved, actually. It was after Pierre was no longer here and I was translating this, that I suddenly realized that when Pierre told me he was his double, that meant that the old man was him at that moment. And here I think it's the opposite. I think the double really is this young person that we're going to read now. This is the double of Pierre, who was about to become the person who's going to make his works, and who's just written himself up to this moment when he's leaving the army. Back in the barracks, we undo our uniforms, slip into our civilian clothes for life. Military effects handed over to the quartermasters, packs on our backs. We pass the gate, the sentry boxes. At last, without rank, we run on cracked asphalt 3 or 4 kilometers toward the station between the sodden wheat fields. Do I have the little chain of my identification tag around my neck, or did I return it with the etched digits of its number? Thousands of us wore it around the neck of their corpse, sometimes with the organs mutilated by which they could have transmitted life, a little of their heart, their spirit, their breath in the world and the breath of the world in them, laid out in the gorges, on the plateaus, the cobblestones, the sidewalks of Algeria. But with them, gathered to them now, and at this hour still, are all those whose throats were slit, noses, lips, ears mutilated, all those whose eyes were gouged out, limbs dismembered, entrails gutted, all those who fled and were tracked down and slaughtered, all those who were beaten to death, cut to pieces, set on fire, babies dashed against the walls, pregnant mothers ripped open, all those who were raped, tortured, boiled alive, hacked and sawed alive, flayed, driven mad, all those who were humiliated for life, all those who went missing, never found, delayed victims of the original crime of the conquest. Toward Paris, toward hunger, toward my father. Humiliated, more by myself than by my judges, but determined to do battle. Everything is to be reconquered, but with what strength of flesh renewed.
Retournés dans les chambrées, nous nous défaisons de notre uniforme, enfilons nos vêtements civils pour la vie. Effet militaire comme une fourrier, sac ou dos, nous passons le portail, les guérites. Enfin, sans rang, nous courons les 3 ou 4 kilomètres de goudron crevassé vers la gare, entre les champs de betteraves trempées. Ai-je au cou la chaînette de ma plaque d'immatriculation, ou l'ai-je rendue avec son numéro gravé dessus? Des milliers d'entre nous la portaient au cou de leurs dépouilles, quelquefois mutilés des organes par lesquels ils auraient pu transmettre la vie, un peu de leur cœur, de leur esprit, de leur souffle au monde et du souffle du monde en eux. Allongés dans les gorges, sur les plateaux, sur les pavés, sur les trottoirs de l'Algérie. Mais avec eux, auprès d'eux maintenant, et à cette heure encore, tous les égorgés, tous les mutilés du nez, des lèvres, des oreilles, tous les énucléés, tous les démembrés, tous les désentraillés, tous les traqués abattus, tous les battus à mort, tous les déchiquetés, tous les enflammés, bébés jetés contre les murs, mères enceintes éventrées, toutes les violées, tous les torturés, tous les ébouillantés vifs, tous les hachés, tous les sciés vifs, tous les écorchés, tous les rendus faux, tous les humiliés à vie, tous les disparus jamais retrouvés, victimes à retardement du crime originel de la conquête. Vers Paris, vers la fin, vers mon père, humilié, plus de moi que de mes juges, mais décidé à en découdre, tout à y reconquérir, mais avec quelle force de chair renouvelée.
Well, thank you very much to the 3 of you. I think now would be the time to open it to the room for questions. If you have any for either the translator or Catherine.
Yeah, I don't think should I need mic now? So just my question, thank you so much, Charlie. My question is for the translators. So how do you manage to translate some texts when Pierre Guyotat was trying to invent a language? Catherine was just referring to performances. I remember, attending these performances in institutions like Malabou, and also the plays such as the Bivouac. And I remember, attending this very long play, and it was like a foreign language for French, the French audience. And also I remember also that he wanted to display the text in the whole, so we could understand that nothing was improvised. It was not unlike the performances, but because there was this kind of improvisation and someone just aside, trying to well, this was with the old Apple Mac, box, and she was trying to transcribe this oral performances, and of course, orality was so important. So, well, with Coma, when he came back to the normative language, okay, so it's beautiful translation. But did you ever try to translate this invented language? I remember, for example, there was this. Sometimes you could hear some words coming back, like les agglus. It was coming back. Say, what is les agglus? Is it a glue? Is it agglutination? Is it some characters? But it was good because it was like a music, But well, did you ever try to translate this kind of text?
That's a wonderful question. There's a beautiful passage in Idiocy that gets close to that. There's a baby of an Algerian resistant who's been killed, so it's a fatherless baby. And the passage ends, it says, what language is the infant's cry? What information can be gathered from his cry? Yeah. Your question is, how do you translate that cry?
Yes.
Which is, and they're different. And so one of them is sound. With that other passage we read where he says, so the sound of the guitar, which I translate into a southern which I change into a southern banjo. I mean, there is some part that's the sound, but it's not sufficient. I mean, it gets you really to some of the key things. Because of Pierre, the depth of Pierre's knowledge, I did feel like I should try and get some correlative depth, at least try in English. So I did spend a year going through, with the crib, etc. I could, I read the Old English corpus, which is very, I read most of the Old English poems, wondering if there were some words that I could use from there. There's a question of translating dialect, which is really interesting in itself. Pasolini writes his poems in dialect. We don't translate Pasolini into Arkansas English or wherever you would, like we translate Pasolini into English. I do think that poses itself with Pierre, and especially with, it's the question, this is why he's ending with La Misère, which I had actually started translating, which I'm returning to translate now, which I had interrupted when Idiocy won the Prix Médicis to translate Idiocy. That's really the place where how do you get that otherness, that weirdness, that oddness back, that inventiveness back into the text. Some of it actually, so for the first 100 pages I have Pierre's notes, but some of it you look for the sources of the invention. Pierre, their mon maui is this word, it's a fun word. It's the kind of like loincloth that they wear. And I asked Pierre, he says, oh, it's the Mowgli. It's from the Jungle Book. So, that stays the Maui in English. But, when you know the source, that was the extraordinary thing about being able to speak to Pierre, is that you could get to the source of the thing. And by knowing the source of the thing, you could somehow get closer to the limits of English, because you could do it guided. If you were just to really just kind of try and be as inventive as Pierre is without knowing which direction he's hitting in, you would go so far wrong so many times it doesn't work. But when you knew the direction, you could start to find that limit of English where he's finding the limit of French. We're trying to.
Bruce Gunderson translated a beginning part of Prostitution as well. So those are just the two attempts, I think, of translating La Langue into English. And I also think, I don't know if it's true, that maybe these, when I read Joyce, Les Joyeux Animaux de la Misère, it's hard to get through, but you can. whereas it's very hard to get through prostitution. And Le Livre is very hard to get through. So Le Livre, the Cabinet Gallery released the LP of it, so you can listen to it. That's a different experience than trying to read through, but I think it seems like this language is a little more dilute, perhaps. Vivier, maybe, less condensed.
Yeah, because there were complications accompanied with the CD inside the.
Oh, right, it's true. Yes,
the book, so it was listened
to. I do think that if you were going to try to translate the works in the strict tongues where it's magically ordered, I think the only way I could imagine doing it is with an Old English 2-beat caesura line where you'd have some of that fluidity still. You could get the structure.
Bruce Wenderson did, I think, New York kind of Puerto Rican.
Yeah. That's the thing about Pierre is he contains all languages, so all dialects.
That was a wonderful panel. Thank you all. I had a question about the sort of sexual and political violence, and but it's not coming. I received Idiocy in the mail, but I didn't have time for some travels to really get into it, so I apologize for that. But now, of course, it's on top of my list. But so this is more coming from the 500 Soldats and the Eden, and I was just wondering about the challenges, which in the more non-normative works of the sort of what I think of as a pansexual dystopia with very strong political mythic quality. It's not a message, but there is this incredibly, and it's a kind of plasticity because it's sex is always going in both directions. That's what I read. There's this kind of reciprocities that go in all directions. And so it's not like you could even follow the normal narrative progression of, a sexual organ or an act of violence gets détourné, so you don't know quite often where it's actually landing. It almost has this ripple effect and goes somewhere else into a whole society. So I think the question here is really about some of the ways in which there's a sort of internal displacement of the transitive act of violence, and then this rippling which gestures towards almost a mythic community, even if it's a very dystopian one on some thematic level.
Maybe I could say a few words on you. Yeah. There are no innocent and there are no evil. There's no good and no evil that can be separated. The last part that I read, there's the French soldiers, and then there are the victims, the Algerian victims. They're in the same paragraph. There's that, the babies, that line of the babies, that's like Eden, that beginning of the babies that get thrown at the end of the Jeep, and so it's, I think, a larger life force that is attaches in different ways to the body, to the breasts, to the genitals, to the mouth, to and to animals. Sometimes it's very lyrical. There's all these scenes of the woman breastfeeding, and then the monkey, and so I don't know if it would be dystopian because that seems like a specific marker, but I feel like it's not. You couldn't say that there's a valence of bad or good, or it's just the scene that's beyond the good and evil, with the life forces and the erotic forces that are just circulating within these bodies and plants and landscapes and animals and, breaking apart the proprietary distinctions of bodies or of assemblages. Yeah. It's like a libido, explosive kind of libido.
Yeah, but it's super close in itself also. That's this metaphor of self-sodomy. He dreams of himself as it can auto-oculage. So I think this person is very disturbing. And I never found his prose erotic, personally. It's super violent.
Right.
And the fantasy of self. Yeah. This is how I understand what you said about all directions, starting with oneself.
I think it's also just as a footnote, it's interesting that didn't Kathy Acker plagiarize Eden, or parts of it? And I think there's an interesting similar gesture of breakage of, patriarchy, but why not also crash and burn matriarchy, childhood, everything else while you're at it,
Yeah, he had performed. Sauveur had seen, there was this conference in 1972 at Cerisy, and Sauveur was there, and Guyotat read Body of the Text and then published it in the semi-text issue on polysexuality. And so that's where Kathy Acker, who was Sauveur's partner, encountered it. So that was that transmission. And then, yes, she did the autoerotic stuff, writing, and yes. Just one last thing. Yeah, he was definitely against eroticism. Eroticism is like a bourgeois kind of, thing. This is not erotic. It's beyond erotic. It's definitely not erotic. I mean, he clearly says that. And I don't remember what term he uses, but in the 70s, it was very clear. Like he was against a bourgeois eroticism.
Well, I have a question really for everyone. I know Peter, especially because you spend so much time with him. You've all talked about, to the extent, your sort of process for translating him. Did you get much insight from him into his process of how he wrote? Because there's both in the French that you read and in the translations, there's at least this sense of, if not quite a sort of stream of consciousness, definitely like a kind of flow, like a sort of spontaneity. Was that how he wrote, or did he do drafts? Did he sort of, I'm just curious to know how much he shared with you, and also whether that informed the translation, his own idiosyncratic technique variety.
There were different periods. The beat sheet, and that's a translation that Matt Fishbeck gave me from the Van Holy shit. He found that beat sheet, so that wasn't me, that was in coma. The masturbation and writing, and kind of thinking about seminal writing and the origin of writing and semen and like this adolescent. So that's the early writing he's talking about in that 1992 conference at Cerisy that he says, and it's linked to orality as well, and it's linked to kind of bondage, a certain apparatus of bondage, and he describes that in the deep. But then he stopped doing that, and there was a little bit of a mythology around him, and like the semen-stained manuscripts and blah, 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 but it wasn't really the case. But then he did have a practice of orality, and there's a beautiful film of him speaking. Jacques Badian did, and then Coma was dictated to Pierre Chopinot, who was also, I think, Guyotat was very much like a mentor. He was so generous. So he did, like this young Pierre Chopinot went and like took dictation from him, and they did Coma together. And then Chopinot now is like a really wonderful writer. So there were different stages of the writing, and then there was the oral improvisational writing. there were some writings, and he talks about that a lot too. There are texts where he talks about his writing, collections of essays, writing as well with the body, with the physiological processes of gas in your intestines. And so he was interested in that question of absolute literality, of producing, the body producing language and what that means. But so I think there was a wide variety of writing processes. And we were talking about that upstairs about Idiocy, that he inserted the text that he wrote for the NRF pretty much directly into here, except the beginning part, because that short introduction that he did for the first article wasn't necessary, since there was a longer introduction in the book as it became kind of a central part of that book. So that one was just directly copy pasted, used. And so I don't think that he did many edits. And I visited his archives, and there are some edits, but crossing out.
Yeah, and for me, when I think of his writings, that idea of Lee, this thing coming from elsewhere and going, he writes somewhere that his words are too much for him, and overmastered him. There's something beyond him that's coming through him. It's too much, even for him. And in any time that he enters that, I think it goes. I had the impression that it went. But I did ask him about Idiocy, because I think Idiocy is really extraordinary in the sense that first of all, it's the book that tells you how he became the person that was going to write the book. I think it actually is that loop, and a little bit like Portrait of the Artist is. And at the same time, it's a book that isn't this normative English, but the end starts to go kind of wild by, not mad, but if it's madness, there's a kind of madness by excessive reason or excessive accumulation of perception and detail that actually becomes almost that. And the book starts to do that by the end. And the style actually gets close to. There's parts of the last section that I was using what I'd been thinking of in ways and with the museum, the sound to translate. I mean, that work, use that throughout, but especially in the last section. And I asked Pierre once, I said, because this is a memoir, and he said, everything that happened here happened, but the way that he did it is he went into the scene and then he imagined it from there. So it's kind of like with this when you're talking about writing the double, and when he writes his double, he's writing himself, and the double he's really writing is the youth, himself as the youth. Here, I mean, this is real. These are real scenes, but the act of writing it is the imagination going from there. As far as the process itself, I saw Pierre was very open to all technologies, and so he was writing. Actually, he was the only living writer, that the French National Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Guillaume Faux would come once a week, and there was a complete collection of everything that Pierre made. So if you wrote Pierre a text message or he wrote you one, it was in there. And one of the reasons is too, all of his iPad and his computer had all these states of the text. And I remember one time I went through so many drafts of this translation. Actually, I should mention Helen Plotkin, who so kindly read these every word, and was so extraordinary throughout this translation, and her suggestions and her ear. I would sometimes I put a little asterisk next to a word, or I had these slashes with two different words, and I showed Pierre once. He said, "Oh yeah, I do that too." He said, "No, there's a word, and it's like you put an asterisk next to it because he knows there's a word that's near it." So there were different drafts. And I also saw on Pierre's computer, there's this text, Amora Machel, which is the legendary text announced each year in Getting House catalogs since 1982. The text that causes the coma, which is en langue. And Pierre showed me on his computer the different versions of it. And there were many versions in different colors. And this is the text which by this great great work of Guillaume Faux, is actually coming out in February, and they went through these versions and they found the thread of the text. But there were many versions.
And in the Deep too, he talks about how he would write and he would take notes. He would write a day and then take notes, like what he would do for the next day. And so he would know like what he had to write. And I think there is a tension, I will say this, with like the text messages and all that stuff, like a kind of hagiography of him that, you know, he wasn't against, but maybe perhaps was a little bit against, but there is also a little bit of, I don't know, institutionalization of like as the great French modernist writer of the Republic or something, like, you know, I don't want to end on that, but yeah.
Well, on that note, thank you all. Thank you so much, Nora.
Thank you, Selma.
And Peter, also Courtney, for your help organizing this. And if you like the wonderful translation Peter did, I think you can acquire a book at the